This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Miette of Miette's Bedtime Story Podcast. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 10. We lived thus near 2 years, only with this exception, that he went 3 times to London in that time, and once he continued there 4 months. But, to do him justice, he always supplied me with money to subsist me very handsomely. Had we continued thus, I confess we had had much to boast of. But, as wise men say, it is ill venturing too near the brink of a command, so we found it. And here again I must do him the justice to own that the first breach was not on his part. It was one night that we were in bed together, warm and merry, and having drunk, I think, a little more wine that night, both of us, than usual, although not in the least to disorder either of us, when, after some other follies which I cannot name, and being clasped close in his arms, I told him, I repeat it with shame and horror of soul, that I could find in my heart to discharge him of his engagement for 1 night, and no more. He took me at my word immediately, and after that there was no resisting him, neither indeed had I any mind to resist him any more, let what would come of it. Thus the government of our virtue was broken, and I exchanged the place of friend for that unmusical, harsh-sounding title of whore. In the morning we were both at our penitentials. I cried very heartily. He expressed himself very sorry, but that was all either of us could do at the time, and the way being thus cleared, and the bars of virtue and conscience thus removed, we had the less difficult afterwards to struggle with. It was but a dull kind of conversation that we had together for all the rest of the week. I looked on him with blushes, and every now and then started that melancholy objection, what if I should be with child now? What will become of me then? He encouraged me by telling me that as long as I was true to him he would be so to me, and since it was gone such a length, which indeed he never intended, yet if I was with child he would take care of that and of me too. This hardened us both. I assured him that if I was with child I would die for want of a midwife rather than name him as the father of it, and he assured me I should never want if I should be with child. These mutual assurances hardened us in the thing, and after this we repeated the crime as often as we pleased, till at length, as I had feared, so it came to pass, and I was indeed with child. After I was sure it was so, and I had satisfied him of it too, we began to think of taking measures for the managing it, and I proposed trusting the secret to my landlady and asking her advice, which he agreed to. My landlady, a woman, as I found, used to such things, made light of it. She said she knew it would come to that at last, and made us very merry about it. As I said above, we found her an experienced old lady at such work. She undertook everything, engaged to procure a midwife and a nurse, to satisfy all inquiries, and bring us off with reputation. And she did so very dexterously indeed. When I grew near my time, she desired my gentleman to go away to London, or make as if he did so. When he was gone, she acquainted the parish officers that there was a lady ready to lie in at her house, but that she knew her husband very well, and gave them, as she pretended, an account of his name, which she called Sir Walter Cleave, telling them he was a very worthy gentleman, and that she would answer for all inquiries and the like. This satisfied the parish officers presently, and I lay in with as much credit as I could have done if I had really been my Lady Cleave, and was assisted in my travail by 3 or 4 of the best citizens' wives of Bath who lived in the neighbourhood, which, however, made me a little more expensive to him. I often expressed my concern about it, but he bid me not to be concerned about it. As he had furnished me very sufficiently with money for the extraordinary expenses of my lying in, I had everything very handsome about me, but it did not affect to be gay or extravagant neither. Besides, knowing my own circumstances, and knowing the world as I had done, and that such kind of things do not often last long, I took care to lay up as much money as I could for a wet day, as I called it, making him believe it was all spent upon the extraordinary appearance of things in my lying in. By this means, and including what he had given me above, I had, at the end of my lying in, about 200 guineas by me, including also what was left of my own. I was brought to bed of a fine boy indeed, and a charming child it was. And when he heard of it, he wrote me a very kind, obliging letter about it, and then told me he thought it would look better for me to come away for London as soon as I was up and well, that he had provided apartments for me at Hammersmith, and if I came thither only from London, and then after a little while I should go back to the Bath, and he would go with me. I liked this offer very well, and accordingly hired a coach on purpose, and taking my child and a wet nurse to tend and suckle it, and a maid-servant with me, away I went for London. He met me at Reading in his own chariot, and taking me into that, left the servant and the child in the hired coach, and so he brought me to my new lodgings at Hammersmith, with which I had abundance of reason to be very well pleased, for they were very handsome rooms, and I was very well accommodated. And now I was indeed in the height of what I might call my prosperity, and I wanted nothing but to be a wife, which, however, could not be in this case. There was no room for it, and therefore on all occasions I studied to save what I could, as I have said above, against a time of scarcity, knowing well enough that such things as these do not always continue, that men that keep mistresses often change them, grow weary of them, or jealous of them, or something or other happens to make them withdraw their bounty, and sometimes the ladies that are thus well used are not careful by a prudent conduct to preserve the esteem of their persons, or the nice article of their fidelity, and then they are justly cast off with contempt. But I was secured in this point, for as I had no inclination to change, so I had no manner of acquaintance in the whole house, and so no temptation to look any farther. I kept no company but in the family when I lodged, and with the clergyman's lady at next door, so that when he was absent I visited nobody, nor did he ever find me out of my chamber or parlour. When he came down, if I went anywhere to take the air, it was always with him. The living in this manner with him, and his with me, was certainly the most undesigned thing in the world. He often protested to me that when he first became acquainted with me, and even to the very night when we first broke in upon our rules, he never had the least design of lying with me, that he always had a sincere affection for me, but not the least real inclination to do what he had done. I assured him I never suspected him, that if I had I should not so easily have yielded to the freedom which brought it on, but that it was all a surprise, and was owing to the accident of our having yielded too far to our mutual inclinations that night. And indeed I have often observed since, and leave it as a caution to the readers of this story, that we ought to be cautious of gratifying our inclinations in loose and lewd freedoms, lest we find our resolutions of virtue fail us in this junction when their assistance should be most necessary. It is true, and I have confessed it before, that from the first hour I began to converse with him, I resolved to let him lie with me if he offered it. But it was because I wanted his help and assistance, and I knew no other way of securing him than that. But when were that night together, and, as I have said, had gone such a length, I found my weakness. The inclination was not to be resisted, but I was obliged to yield up all even before he asked it. However, he was so just to me that he never upbraided me with that, nor did he ever express the least dislike of my conduct on any other occasion, but always protested he was as much delighted with my company as he was the first hour we came together. I mean, came together as bedfellows. It is true that he had no wife, that is to say, she was as no wife to him, and so I was in no danger that way, but the just reflections of conscience oftentimes snatch a man, especially a man of sense, from the arms of a mistress, as it did him at last, though on another occasion. On the other hand, though I was not without secret reproaches of my own conscience for the life I led, and that even in the greatest height of the satisfaction I ever took, yet I had the terrible prospect of poverty and starving, which lay on me as a frightful spectre, so that there was no looking behind me. But as poverty brought me into it, so fear of poverty kept me in it, and I frequently resolved to leave it quite off if I could, but come to lay up money enough to maintain me. But these were thoughts of no weight, and whenever he came to me they vanished, for his company was so delightful that there was no being melancholy when he was there. The reflections were all the subject of those hours when I was alone. I lived 6 years in this happy but unhappy condition, in which time I brought him 3 children. But only the first of them lived, and though I removed twice in those 6 years, yet I came back in the 6th year to my first lodgings at Hammersmith. Here it was that I was one morning surprised with a kind but melancholy letter from my gentleman, intimating that he was very ill, and was afraid he should have another fit of sickness, but that his wife's relations being in the house with him, it would not be practicable to have me with him, which, however, he expressed his great satisfaction in, and that he wished I could be allowed to tend and nurse him as I did before. I was very much concerned at this account, and was very impatient to know how it was with him. I waited a fortnight or thereabouts, and heard nothing, which surprised me, and I began to be very uneasy indeed. I think I may say that for the next fortnight I was near to distracted. It was my particular difficulty that I did not know directly where he was, for I understood at first he was in the lodgings of his wife's mother, but having removed myself to London, I soon found, by the help of the direction I had for writing my letters to him, how to inquire after him. and there I found that he was at a house in Bloomsbury, whither he had, a little before he fell sick, removed his whole family, and that his wife and wife's mother were in the same house, though the wife was not suffered to know that she was in the same house with her husband. Here I also soon understood that he was at the last extremity, which made me almost at the last extremity too, to have a true account. One night I had the curiosity to disguise myself like a servant maid, in a round cap and straw hat, and went to the door as sent by a lady of its neighbourhood, where he lived before, and giving master and mistress's service, I said I was sent to know how Mr. did, and how he had rested that night. In delivering this message I got the opportunity I desired, for, speaking with one of the maids, I held a long gossip's tale with her, and had all the particulars of his illness, which I found was a pleurisy, attended with a cough and a fever. She told me also who was in the house, and how his wife was, who by her relation they were in some hopes might recover her understanding. But as to the gentleman himself, in short, she told me the doctors said there was very little hopes of him, that in the morning they thought he had been dying, and that he was but little better then, for they did not expect that he could live over the next night. This was heavy news for me, and I began now to see an end of my prosperity, and to see also that it was very well I had played the good housewife and secured or saved something while he was alive, for that now I had no view of my own living before me. It lay very heavy upon my mind too that I had a son, a fine lovely boy about 5 years old, and no provision made for it, at least that I knew of. With these considerations, and a sad heart, I went home for that evening, and began to cast with myself how I should live, and in what manner to bestow myself for the residue of my life. You may be sure that I could not rest without inquiring again very quickly what was become of him, and not venturing to go myself, I sent several sham messengers, until after a fortnight's waiting longer, I found that there was hopes of his life, though he was still very ill. Then I abated my sending any more to the house, and in some time after I learned in the neighbourhood that he was about house, and then that he was abroad again. I made no doubt then but that I should hear soon of him, and began to comfort myself with my circumstances, being, as I thought, recovered. I waited a week and 2 weeks, and with much surprise and amazement I waited near 2 months and heard nothing, but that, being recovered, he was gone into the country for the air, and for the better recovery after his distemper. After this it was yet 2 more months, and then I understood he was come to his city house again, but still I heard nothing from him. I had written several letters for him, and directed them as usual, and found 2 or 3 of them had been called for, but not the rest. I wrote again in a more pressing manner than ever, and in one of them let him know that I must be forced to wait on him myself, representing my circumstances, the rent of lodgings to pay, and the provision for the child wanting, and my own deplorable condition destitute of subsistence, for his most solemn engagement to take care of and provide for me. I took a copy of this letter, and finding it lay at the house near a month, and was not called for, I found means to have the copy of it put into his own hands at a coffee-house, where I had by inquiry found he used to go. This letter forced an answer from him, by which, though I found I was to be abandoned, Yet I found he had sent a letter to me some time before, desiring me to go down to the bath again. Its contents I shall come to presently. It is true that sick beds are the time when such correspondences as these are looked on with different countenances, as seen with other eyes than we saw them with, or than they appeared with before. My lover had been at the gates of death, and at the very brink of eternity, and, it seems, had been struck with a due remorse, and with sad reflections upon his past life of gallantry and levity, and among the rest criminal correspondence with me, which was neither more nor less than a long-continued life of adultery, and represented itself as it really was, not as it had been formerly thought by him to be, and he looked upon it now with a just and religious abhorrence. I cannot but observe also, and leave it for the direction of my sex in such cases of pleasure, that whenever sincere repentance succeeds such a crime as this, there never fails to attend a hatred of the object, and the more the affection might seem to be before, the hatred will be more in proportion. It will always be so. Indeed, it can be no otherwise, for there cannot be a true and sincere abhorrence of the offence, and the love to the cause of it remain. There will, with an abhorrence of the sin, be found a detestation of the fellow sinner. You can expect no other. I found it so here, through good manners and justice in this gentleman, kept him from carrying it on to the extreme, but the short history of his part in this affair was thus. He perceived by my last letter, and by all the rest which he went for after, that I was not gone to Bath, that his first letter had not come to my hand, upon which he writes to me this following. Madam, I am surprised that my letter dated the 8th of last month did not come to your hand. I give you my word it was delivered at your lodgings and to the hands of your maid. I need not acquaint you with what has been my condition for some time past, and how, having been at the edge of the grave, I am, by the unexpected and undeserved mercy of heaven, restored again. In the condition I have been in, it cannot be strange to you that our unhappy correspondence had not been the least of the burdens which lay upon my conscience. I need say no more. Those things that must be repented of must also be reformed. I wish you would think of going back to the Bath. I enclose you here a bill for £50 for clearing yourself at your lodgings and carrying you down, and hope it will be no surprise to you to add that on this account only, and not for any offence given me on your side, I can see you no more. I will take due care of the child, leave him where he is, or take him with you, as you please. I wish you like the reflections, and that they may be to your advantage. I am, etc. I was struck with this letter as with 1,000 wounds, such as I cannot describe. The reproaches of my own conscience were such as I cannot express, for I was not blind to my own crime, and I reflected that I might, with less offence, have continued with my brother and lived with him as a wife, since there was no crime in our marriage on that score, neither of us knowing it. But I never once reflected that I was all this while a married woman, a wife to Mr. the linen-draper, who, though he had left me by the necessity of his circumstances, had no power to discharge me from the marriage contract which was between us, or to give me a legal liberty to marry again, so that I had been no less than a whore and an adulteress all this while. I then reproached myself with the liberties I had taken, and how I had been a snare to this gentleman, and that indeed I was principal in the crime. That now he was mercifully snatched out of the gulf by a convincing work upon his mind, but that I was left as if I was forsaken of God's grace, and abandoned by heaven to a continuing in my wickedness. Under these reflections I continued very pensive and sad for near a month, and did not go down to the bath, having no inclination to be with the woman whom I was with before, lest, as I thought, she should prompt me to some wicked course of life again, as she had done, and besides I was very loath that she should know I was cast off as above. And now I was greatly perplexed about my little boy. It was death to me to part with a child, and yet when I considered the danger of being one time or other left with him to keep without a maintenance to support him, I then resolved to leave him where he was. But then I concluded also to be near him myself too, that I then might have the satisfaction of seeing him without the care of providing for him. I sent my gentleman a short letter, therefore, that I had obeyed his orders in all things but that of going back to the bath, which I could not think of for many reasons, that however parting from him was a wound to me that I could never recover, yet I was fully satisfied his reflections were just, and would be very far from desiring to obstruct his reformation or repentance. Then I represented my own circumstances to him in the most moving terms that I was able. I told him that those unhappy distresses which first moved him to a generous and honest friendship for me would, I hope, move him to a little concern for me now, though the criminal part of our correspondence, which I believed neither of us intended to fall into at the time, was broken off. That I desired to repent as sincerely as he had done, but entreated him to put me in some condition that I might not be exposed to the temptations which the devil never fails to excite us to from the frightful prospect of poverty and distress. And if he had the least apprehensions of my being troublesome to him, I begged he would put me in a posture to go back to my mother in Virginia, from which he knew I came, and that would put an end to all his fears on that account. I concluded that if he would send me £50 more to facilitate my going away, I would send him back a general release, and would promise never to disturb him with any more importunities, unless it was to hear of the well-doing of the child, whom, if I found my mother living and my circumstances able, I would send for to come over with me, and take him also effectually off his hands. This was indeed all a cheat thus far, viz. That I had no intention to go to Virginia, as the account of my former affairs there may convince anybody of, but the business was to get this last £50 off him if possible, knowing well enough that it would be the last penny I was ever to expect. However, the argument I used, namely, of giving him a general release and never troubling him any more, prevailed effectually with him, and he sent me a bill for the money by a person who brought with him a general release for me to sign, and which I frankly signed, and received the money, and thus, though full sore against my will, a final end was put to this affair. And here I cannot but reflect upon the unhappy consequence of two great freedoms between persons stated as we were, upon the pretence of innocent intentions, love of friendship, and the like, for the flesh has generally so great a share in these friendships that is great odds but inclination prevails at last over the most solemn resolutions, and that vice breaks in at the breaches of decency, which really innocent friendships ought to preserve with the greatest strictness. But I leave the readers of these things to their own just reflections, which they will be more able to make effectual than I, who soon forgot myself, and am therefore but a very indifferent monitor. End of section 10.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Nicole Doolin. On the web at nicoledoolin.com. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 11. I was now a single person again, as I may call myself. I was loosed from all the obligations either of wedlock or mistressship in the world, except my husband the linen-draper, whom I having not now heard from in almost 15 years, nobody could blame me for thinking myself entirely freed from, seeing also he had at his going away told me that if I did not hear frequently from him, I should conclude he was dead, and I might freely marry again to whom I pleased. I now began to cast up my accounts. I had by many letters and much importunity, and with the intercession of my mother too, had a second return of some goods from my brother, as I now call him, in Virginia, to make up the damage of the cargo I brought away with me, and this too was upon the condition of my sealing a general release to him, and to send it him by his correspondent at Bristol, which, though I thought hard of, yet I was obliged to promise to do. However, I managed so well in this case that I got my goods away before the release was signed, and then I always found something or other to say to evade the thing, and to put off the signing it at all, till at length I pretended I must write to my brother, and have his answer before I could do it. Including this recruit, and before I got the last £50, I found my strength to amount, put all together, to about £400, so that with that I had about £450. I had saved above £100 more, but I met with a disaster with that, which was this, that a goldsmith in whose hands I had trusted it broke, so I lost £70 of my money, the man's composition not making above £30 out of his £100. I had a little plate, but not much, and was well enough stocked with clothes and linen. With this stock I had the world to begin again, but you are to consider that I was not now the same woman as when I lived at Redriff, for, first of all, I was near 20 years older, and did not look the better for my age, nor for my rambles to Virginia and back again. And though I omitted nothing that might set me out to advantage, except painting, for that I never stooped to, and had pride enough to think I did not want it, yet there would always be some difference seen between 25 and 20 and 2 and 40. I cast about innumerable ways for my future state of life, and began to consider very seriously what I should do. But nothing offered. I took care to make the world take me for something more than I was, and had it given out that I was a fortune, and that my estate was in my own hands, the last of which was very true. The first of it was as above. I had no acquaintance, which was one of my worst misfortunes, and the consequence of that was, I had no adviser, at least one who could assist and advise together, and, above all, I had nobody to whom I could in confidence commit the secret of my circumstances to, and could depend upon for their secrecy and fidelity. And I found by experience that to be friendless in the worst condition, next to being in want that a woman can be reduced to, I say a woman, because 'tis evident men can be their own advisers, and their own directors, and know how to work themselves out of difficulties and into business better than women. But if a woman has no friend to communicate her affairs to, and to advise and assist her, 'tis 10 to 1 but she is undone. Nay, and the more money she has, the more danger she is in of being wronged and deceived. And this was my case in the affair of the £100 which I left in the hands of the goldsmith, as above, whose credit, it seems, was upon the ebb before. But I, that had no knowledge of things and nobody to consult with, knew nothing of it, and so lost my money. In the next place, when a woman is thus left desolate and void of counsel, she is just like a bag of money or a jewel dropped on the highway, which is a prey to the next comer. If a man of virtue and upright principles happens to find it, he will have it cried, and the owner may come to hear of it again. But how many times shall such a thing fall into hands that will make no scruple of seizing it for their own, to once that it shall come into good hands? This was evidently my case, for I was now a loose, unguided creature, and had no help, no assistance, no guide for my conduct. I knew what I aimed at, and what I wanted, but knew nothing how to pursue the end by direct means. I wanted to be placed in a settled state of living, and had I happened to meet with a sober, good husband, I should have been as faithful and true a wife to him as virtue itself could have formed. If I had been otherwise, the vice came in always at the door of necessity, not at the door of inclination, and I understood too well by the want of it what the value of a settled life was, to do anything to forfeit the felicity of it. Nay, I should have made the better wife for all the difficulties I had passed through, by a great deal. Nor did I, in any of the time that I had been a wife, given my husbands the least uneasiness on account of my behaviour. But all this was nothing. I found no encouraging prospect. I waited, I lived regularly, and with as much frugality as became my circumstances, but nothing offered, nothing presented, and the main stock wasted apace. What to do I knew not. The terror of approaching poverty lay hard upon my spirits. I had some money, but where to place it I knew not, nor would the interest of it maintain me, at least not in London. At length a new scene opened. There was in the house where I lodged a north country woman, that went for a gentlewoman, and nothing was more frequent in her discourse than her account of the cheapness of provisions, and the easy way of living in her country. How plentiful and how cheap everything was, what good company they kept, and the like, till at last I told her she almost tempted me to go and live in her country, for I that was a widow, though I had sufficient to live on, yet had no way of increasing it, and that I found I could not live here under £100 a year, unless I kept no company, no servant, made no appearance, and buried myself in privacy, as if I was obliged to it by necessity. I should have observed that she was always made to believe, as everybody else was, that I was a great fortune, or at least that I had 3,000 or 4,000 pounds, if not more, and all in my own hands. And she was mighty sweet upon me, when she thought me inclined in the least to go into her country. She said she had a sister lived near Liverpool, that her brother was a considerable gentleman there, and had a great estate also in Ireland, that she would go down there in about 2 months, and if I would give her my company thither, I should be as welcome as herself for a month or more as I pleased, till I should see how I liked the country, and if I thought fit to live there, she would undertake they would take care, though they did not entertain lodgers themselves. They would recommend me to some agreeable family, where I should be placed to my content. If this woman had known my real circumstances, she would never have laid so many snares, and taken so many weary steps to catch a poor desolate creature, that was good for little when it was caught. And indeed I, whose case was almost desperate, and thought I could not be much worse, was not very anxious about what might befall me, provided they did me no personal injury. So I suffered myself, though not without a great deal of invitation, and great professions of sincere friendship and real kindness. I say I suffered myself to be prevailed upon to go with her, and accordingly I packed up my baggage, and put myself in a posture for a journey, though I did not absolutely know whither I was to go. And now I found myself in great distress. What little I had in the world was all in money, except as before, a little plate, some linen, and my clothes. As for my household stuff, I had little or none, for I had lived always in lodgings, but I had not one friend in the world with whom to trust that little I had, or to direct me how to dispose of it, and this perplexed me night and day. I thought of the bank, and of the other companies in London, but I had no friend to commit the management of it to, and keep and carry about with me bank bills, tallies, orders, and such things. I looked upon it as unsafe, that if they were lost, my money was lost, and then I was undone, and, on the other hand, I might be robbed and perhaps murdered in a strange place for them. This perplexed me strangely, and what to do I knew not. It came in my thoughts one morning that I would go to the bank myself, where I had often been to receive the interest of some bills I had, which had interest payable on them, and where I found a clerk to whom I applied myself, very honest and just to me, and particularly so fair one time that when I had mistold my money, and taken less than my due, and was coming away, he set me to rights, and gave me the rest, which he might have put into his own pocket. I went to him and represented my case very plainly, and asked if he would trouble himself to be my adviser, who was a poor friendless widow, and knew not what to do. He told me if I desired his opinion of anything within the reach of his business, he would do his endeavour that I should not be wronged, but that he would also help me to a good sober person, who was a grave man of his acquaintance, who was a clerk in such business too, though not in their house, whose judgment was good, and whose honesty I might depend upon. For, added he, I will answer for him, and for every step he takes. If he wrongs you, madam, of 1 farthing, it shall lie at my door. I will make it good. And he delights to assist people in such cases. He does it as an act of charity. I was a little at a stand in this discourse, but after some pause I told him I had rather have depended upon him, because I had found him honest, but if that could not be, I would take his recommendation sooner than any one else's. I dare say, madam, says he, that you will be as well satisfied with my friend as with me, and he is thoroughly able to assist you, which I am not. It seems he had his hands full of the business of the bank, and had engaged to meddle with no other business than that of his office, which I heard afterwards, but did not understand then. He added that his friend should take nothing of me for his advice or assistance, and this indeed encouraged me very much. He appointed the same evening, after the bank was shut and business over, for me to meet him and his friend, and indeed as soon as I saw his friend, and he began but to talk of the affair, I was fully satisfied that I had a very honest man to deal with. His countenance spoke it, and his character, as I heard afterwards, was everywhere so good that I had no room for any more doubts upon me. After the first meeting, in which I only said what I had said before, we parted, and he appointed me to come the next day to him, telling me I might in the meantime satisfy myself of him by inquiry, which, however, I knew not how well to do, having no acquaintance myself. Accordingly I met him the next day, when I entered more freely with him into my case. I told him my circumstances at large, that I was a widow come over from America, perfectly desolate and friendless, that I had a little money, and but a little, and was almost distracted for fear of losing it, having no friend in the world to trust with the management of it, that I was going into the north of England to live cheap, that my stock might not waste, that I would willingly lodge my money in the bank, but that I durst not carry the bills about me, and the like, as above, and how to correspond with it, or with whom, I knew not. He told me I might lodge the money in the bank as an account, and its being entered into the books would entitle me to the money at any time, and if I was in the north, I might draw bills on the cashier, and receive it when I would, but that then it would be esteemed as running cash, and the bank would give no interest for it, that I might buy stock with it, and so it would lie in store for me, but that then if I wanted to dispose of it, I must come up to town on purpose to transfer it, and even it would be with some difficulty I should receive the half-yearly dividend, unless I was here in person, or had some friend I could trust with having the stock in his name to do it for me, and that would have the same difficulty in it as before. And with that he looked hard at me and smiled a little. At last says he, "Why do you not get a head steward, madam, that may take you and your money together into keeping, and then you would have the trouble taken off your hands?" "Ay, sir, and the money too, it may be," said I, "for truly I find the hazard that way is as much as 'tis t'other way." But I remember I said secretly to myself, "I wish he would ask me the question fairly. I would consider very seriously on it before I said no." He went on a good way with me, and I thought once or twice he was in earnest, but to my real affliction I found at last he had a wife. But when he owned he had a wife, he shook his head and said with some concern that indeed he had a wife and no wife. I began to think he had been in the condition of my late lover, and that his wife had been distempered or lunatic, or some such thing. However, we had not much more discourse at that time, but he told me he was in too much hurry of business then, but that if I would come home to his house after their business was over, he would by that time consider what might be done for me, to put my affairs in a posture of security. I told him I would come, and desired to know where he lived. He gave me a direction in writing, and when he gave it me, he read it to me and said, "There 'tis, madam, if you dare trust yourself with me." "Yes, sir," said I. "I believe I may venture to trust you with myself, for you have a wife, you say, and I don't want a husband. Besides, I dare trust you with my money, which is all I have in the world, and if that were gone, I may trust myself anywhere." He said some things in jest that were very handsome and mannerly, and would have pleased me very well if they had been in earnest. But that passed over. I took the directions, and appointed to attend him at his house at 7 o'clock the same evening. When I came, he made several proposals for my placing my money in the bank, in order to my having interest for it, but still some difficulty or other came in the way, which he objected as not safe, and I found such a sincere, disinterested honesty in him, that I began to muse with myself, that I had certainly found the honest man I wanted, and that I could never put myself into better hands. So I told him with a great deal of frankness that I had never met with a man or woman yet that I could trust, or in whom I could think myself safe, but that I saw he was so disinterestedly concerned for my safety, that I said I would freely trust him with the management of that little I had, if he would accept to be steward for a poor widow that could give him no salary. He smiled, and, standing up with great respect, saluted me. He told me he could not but take it very kindly that I had so good an opinion of him, that he would not deceive me, that he would do anything in his power to serve me, and expect no salary, but that he could not by any means accept of a trust, that it might bring him to be suspected of self-interest, and that if I should die, he might have disputes with my executors, which he should be very loath to encumber himself with. I told him if those were all his objections, I would soon remove them, and convince him that there was not the least room for any difficulty. For that first, as for suspecting him, if ever I should do it, now is the time to suspect him, and not put the trust into his hands, and whenever I did suspect him, he could but throw it up then, and refuse to go any further. Then, as to executors, I assured him I had no heirs, nor any relations in England, and I should alter my condition before I died, and then his trust and trouble should cease together, which, however, I had no prospect of yet. But I told him if I died as I was, it should be all his own, and he would deserve it by being so faithful to me as I was satisfied he would be. He changed his countenance at this discourse, and asked me how I came to have so much good will for him, and, looking very much pleased, said he might very lawfully wish he was a single man for my sake. I smiled, and told him, as he was not, my offer could have no design upon him in it, and to wish, as he did, was not to be allowed. 'Twas criminal to his wife. He told me I was wrong, for, says he, "Madam, as I said before, I have a wife and no wife, and 'twould be no sin to me to wish her hanged, if that were all." "I know nothing of your circumstances that way, sir," said I, "but it cannot be innocent to wish your wife dead." "I tell you," says he again, "she is a wife and no wife. You don't know what I am, or what she is." "That's true," said I. "Sir, I do not know what you are, but I believe you to be an honest man, and that's the cause of all my confidence in you." "Well, well," says he, "and so I am, I hope, too. But I am something else, too, madam, for," says he, "to be plain with you, I am a cuckold, and she is a whore." He spoke it in a kind of jest, but it was with such an awkward smile that I perceived it was what struck very close to him, and he looked dismally when he said it. "That alters the case indeed, sir," said I. "As to that part you were speaking of, But a cuckold, you know, may be an honest man. It does not alter that case at all. Besides, I think, said I, since your wife is so dishonest to you, you are too honest to her to own her for your wife. But that, said I, is what I have nothing to do with. Nay, says he, I do not think to clear my hands of her, for, to be plain with you, madam, added he, I am no contented cuckold neither. On the other hand, I assure you it provokes me the highest degree, but I can't help myself. She that will be a whore will be a whore. I waived the discourse, and began to talk of my business, but I found he could not have done with it, so I let him alone, and he went on to tell me all the circumstances of his case, too long to relate here, particularly that, having been out of England some time before he came to the post he was in, she had had 2 children in the meantime by an officer of the army, and that when he came to England, and upon her submission, took her again, and maintained her very well, yet she ran away from him with a linen-draper's apprentice, robbed him of what she could come at, and continued to live from him still. So that, madam, says he, she is a whore, not by necessity, which is the common bait of your sex, but by inclination, and for the sake of the vice. Well, I pitied him, and wished him well rid of her, and still would have talked of my business, but it would not do. At last he looked steadily at me. Look you, madam, says he, you came to ask advice of me, and I will serve you as faithfully as if you were my own sister. But I must turn the tables, since you oblige me to do it, and are so friendly to me, and I think I must ask advice of you. Tell me, what must a poor abused fellow do with a whore? What can I do to do myself justice upon her? Alas, sir, says I, 'tis a case too nice for me to advise in, but it seems she has run away from you, so you are rid of her fairly. What can you desire more? Aye, she is gone indeed, said he, but I am not clear of her for all that. That's true, says I. She may indeed run you into debt, but the law has furnished you with methods to prevent that also. You may cry her down, as they call it. No, no, says he, that is not the case neither. I have taken care of all that. 'Tis not that part that I speak of, but I would be rid of her so that I might marry again. Well, sir, says I, then you must divorce her, if you can prove what you say. You may certainly get that done, and then, I suppose, you are free. That's very tedious and expensive, says he. Why, says I, if you can get any woman you like to take your word, I suppose your wife would not dispute the liberty with you that she takes herself. Aye, says he, but 'twould be hard to bring an honest woman to do that. And for the other sort, says he, I have had enough of her to meddle with any more whores. It occurred to me presently, I would have taken your word with all my heart if you had but asked me the question, but that was to myself. To him I replied, Why, you shut the door against any honest woman excepting you, for you condemn all that should venture upon you at once, and conclude that really a woman that takes you now can't be honest. Why, says he, I wish it would satisfy me that an honest woman would take me. I'd venture it. And then he turned short upon me. Will you take me, madam? That's not a fair question, says I. After what you have said, however, lest you should think I wait only for a recantation of it, I shall answer you plainly. No, not I. My business is of another kind with you, and I did not expect you would have turned my serious application to you, in my own distracted case, into a comedy. Why, madam, says he, my case is as distracted as yours can be, and I stand in as much need of advice as you do, for I think, if I have not relief somewhere, I shall be made myself, and I know not what course to take, I protest to you. Why, sir, says I, 'tis easy to give advice in your case, much easier than it is in mine. Speak, then, says he, I beg of you, for now you encourage me. Why, says I, if your case is so plain as you say it is, you may be legally divorced, and then you may find honest women enough to ask the question of fairly. The sex is not so scarce that you can want a wife. Well, then, said he, I am in earnest. I'll take your advice. But shall I ask you one question seriously beforehand? Any question, said I, but that you did before. No, that answer will not do, said he. For, in short, that is the question I shall ask. You may ask what questions you please, but you have my answer to that already, said I. Besides, sir, said I, can you think so ill of me that as I would give any answer to such a question beforehand? Can any woman alive believe you in earnest, or think you design anything but to banter her? Oh, well, says he, I do not banter you, I am in earnest, consider of it. But, sir, says I, a little gravely, I came to you about my own business. Beg of you to let me know what you will advise me to do. I will be prepared, says he, against you come again. Nay, says I, you have forbid my coming any more. Why so? Said he, and looked a little surprised. Because, said I, you can't expect I should visit you on the account you talk of. Well, says he, you shall promise me to come again, however, and I will not say any more of it till I have gotten the divorce. But I desire you will prepare to be better conditioned when that's done. For you shall be the woman, or I will not be divorced at all. Why, I owe it to your unlooked-for kindness, if it were to nothing else, but I have other reasons, too. He could not have said anything in the world that pleased me better. However, I knew that the way to secure him was to stand off while the thing was so remote, as it appeared to be, and that it was time enough to accept of it when he was able to perform it. So I said very respectfully to him, it was time enough to consider of these things when he was in a condition to talk of them. In the meantime I told him I was going a great way from him, and he would find objects enough to please him better. We broke off here for the present, and he made me promise him to come again the next day. For his resolutions upon my own business, which, after some pressing I did, though, had he seen farther into me, I wanted no pressing on that account. End of Section 11. Recorded by Nicole Doolin. On the web at NicoleDoolin.com.
The LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Nicole Doolin on the web at NicoleDoolin.com. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. Section 12. I came the next evening, accordingly, and brought my maid with me, to let him see that I kept a maid. But I sent her away as soon as I was gone in. He would have had me let my maid have stayed, but I would not, but ordered her aloud to come for me again about 9 o'clock. But he forbade me that, and told me he would see me safe home, which, by the way, I was not very well pleased with, supposing he might do that to know where I lived, and inquire into my character and circumstances. However, I ventured that, for all that the people there or thereabout knew of me was to my advantage, and all the character he had of me, after he had inquired, was that I was a woman of fortune, and that I was a very modest, sober body, which, whether true or not in the main, yet you may see how necessary it is for all women who expect anything in the world, to preserve the character of their virtue, even when perhaps they may have sacrificed the thing itself. I found, and was not a little pleased with it, that he had provided a supper for me. I found also he lived very handsomely, and had a house very handsomely furnished, all of which I was rejoiced at indeed, for I looked upon it as all my own. We had now a second conference upon the subject matter of the last conference. He laid his business very home indeed. He protested his affection to me, and indeed I had no room to doubt it. He declared that it began from the first moment I talked with him, and long before I had mentioned leaving my effects with him. "'Tis no matter when it began," thought I. "If it will but hold, 'twill be well enough." He then told me how much the offer I had made of trusting him with my effects, and leaving them to him, had engaged him. "So I intended it should," thought I. "But then I thought you had been a single man too." After we had supped, I observed he pressed me very hard to drink 2 or 3 glasses of wine, which, however, I declined, but drank 1 glass or 2. He then told me he had a proposal to make me, which I should promise him I would not take ill if I should not grant it. I told him I hoped he would make no dishonourable proposal to me, especially in his own house, and that if it was such, I desired he would not propose it, that I might not be obliged to offer any resentment to him that did not become the respect I professed for him, and the trust I had placed in him in coming to his house, and begged of him he would give me leave to go away, and accordingly began to put on my gloves and prepare to be gone, though at the same time I no more intended it than he intended to let me. Well, he importuned me not to talk of going. He assured me he had no dishonourable thing in his thoughts about me, and was very far from offering anything to me that was dishonourable, and if I thought so, he would choose to say no more of it. That part I did not relish at all. I told him I was ready to hear anything that he had to say, depending that he would say nothing unworthy of himself, or unfit for me to hear. Upon this, he told me his proposal was this, that I would marry him, though he had not yet obtained the divorce from the whore his wife, and to satisfy me that he meant honourably, he would promise not to desire me to live with him, or go to bed with him till the divorce was obtained. My heart said yes to this offer at first word, but it was necessary to play the hypocrite a little more with him, so I seemed to decline the motion with some warmth, and besides, a little condemning the thing as unfair, told him that such a proposal could be of no signification but to entangle us both in great difficulties, for if he should not at last obtain the divorce, yet we could not dissolve the marriage, neither could we proceed in it, so that if he was disappointed in the divorce, I left him to consider what a condition we should both be in. In short, I carried on the argument against this so far, that I convinced him it was not a proposal that had any sense in it. Well, then he went from it to another, and that was, that I would sign and seal a contract with him, conditioning to marry him as soon as the divorce was obtained, and to be void if he could not obtain it. I told him such a thing was more rational than the other, but as this was the first time that ever I could imagine him weak enough to be in earnest in this affair, I did not use to say yes at first asking. I would consider of it. I played with this lover as an angler does with a trout. I found I had him fast on the hook, so I jested with his new proposal, and put him off. I told him he knew little of me, and bade him inquire about me. I let him also go home with me to my lodging, though I would not ask him to go in, for I told him it was not decent. In short, I ventured to avoid signing a contract of marriage, and the reason why I did it was because the lady that had invited me so earnestly to go with her into Lancashire insisted so positively upon it, and promised me such great fortunes and such fine things there, that I was tempted to go and try. Perhaps, said I may mend myself very much, and then I made no scruple in my thoughts of quitting my honest citizen, whom I was not so much in love with as not to leave him for a richer. In a word, I avoided a contract, but told him I would go into the north, that he should know where to write to me by the consequence of the business I had entrusted with him, that I would give him a sufficient pledge of my respect for him, for I would leave almost all I had in the world in his hands, and I would thus far give him my word, that as soon as he had sued out a divorce from his first wife, he would send me an account of it. I would come up to London, and that then we would talk seriously of the matter. It was a base design I went with, that I must confess, though I was invited thither with a design much worse than mine was, as the sequel will discover. Well, I went with my friend, as I called her, into Lancashire. All the way we went she caressed me with the utmost appearance of a sincere, undissembled affection, treated me, except my coach hire, all the way, and her brother brought a gentleman's couch to Warrington to receive us, and we were carried from thence to Liverpool with as much ceremony as I could desire. We were also entertained at a merchant's house in Liverpool 3 or 4 days very handsomely. I forbear to tell his name because of what followed. Then she told me she would carry me to an uncle's house of hers, where we should be nobly entertained. She did so. Her uncle, as she called him, sent a coach and 4 horses for us, and we were carried near 40 miles I know not whither. We came, however, to a gentleman's seat, where was a numerous family, a large park, extraordinary company indeed, and where she was called cousin. I told her if she had resolved to bring me into such company as this, she should have let me have prepared myself, and have furnished myself with better clothes. The ladies took no notice of that, and told me very genteelly they did not value people in their country so much by their clothes as they did in London, that their cousin had fully informed them of my quality, and that I did not want clothes to set me off. In short, they entertained me, not like what I was, but like what they thought I had been, namely, a widow lady of great fortune. The first discovery I made here was that the family were all Roman Catholics, and the cousin, too, whom I called my friend. However, I must say that nobody in the world could have behaved better to me, and I had all the civility shown me that I could have had if I had been of their opinion. The truth is, I had not so much principle of any kind as to be nice in point of religion, and I presently learned to speak favourably of the Romish Church. Particularly, I told them I saw little but the prejudice of education in all the difference that were among Christians about religion, and if it had so happened that my father had been a Roman Catholic, I doubted not but I should have been as well pleased with their religion as my own. This obliged them in the highest degree, and as I was besieged day and night with good company and pleasant discourse, so I had 2 or 3 old ladies that lay at me upon the subject of religion too. I was so complacent, that though I would not completely engage, yet I made no scruple to be present at their mass, and to conform to all their gestures as they showed me the pattern. But I would not come too cheap, so that I only in the main encouraged them to expect that I would turn Roman Catholic, if I was instructed in the Catholic doctrine, as they called it, and so the matter rested. I stayed here about 6 weeks, and then my conductor led me back to a country village, about 6 miles from Liverpool, where her brother, as she called him, came to visit me in his own chariot, and in a very good figure, with 2 footmen in a good livery, and the next thing was to make love to me. As it had happened to me, one would think I could not have been cheated, and indeed I thought so myself, having a safe card at home which I resolved not to quit unless I could mend myself very much. However, in all appearance, this brother was a match worth my listening to, and the least his estate was valued at was £1,000 a year. But the sister said it was worth £1,500 a year, and lay most of it in Ireland. I, that was a great fortune, and passed for such, was above being asked how much my estate was, and my false friend, taking it upon a foolish hearsay, had raised it from £500 to £5,000, and by the time she came into the country, she called it £15,000. The Irishman, for such I understood him to be, was stark mad at this bait. In short, he courted me, made me presents, and ran in debt like a madman for the expenses of his equipage and of his courtship. He had, to give him his due, the appearance of an extraordinary fine gentleman. He was tall, well-shaped, and had an extraordinary address, talked as naturally of his park and his stables, of his horses, his gamekeepers, his woods, his tenants, and his servants, as if we had been in the mansion house, and I had seen them all about me. He never so much as asked me about my fortune or estate, but assured me that when we came to Dublin he would jointure me in £600 a year good land, and that we could enter into a deed of settlement or a contract here for the performance of it. This was such language indeed as I had not been used to, and I was here beaten out of all my measures. I had a she-devil in my bosom, every hour telling me how great her brother lived. One time she would come for my orders, how I would have my coaches painted, and how lined, and another time what clothes my page should wear. In short, my eyes were dazzled. I had now lost my power of saying no, and, to cut the story short, I consented to be married. But to be the more private, we were carried farther into the country and married by a Romish clergyman, who I was assured would marry us as effectually as a Church of England parson. I cannot say but I had some reflections in this affair upon the dishonourable forsaking my faithful citizen, who loved me sincerely, and who was endeavouring to quit himself of a scandalous whore by whom he had been indeed barbarously used, and promised himself infinite happiness in his new choice, which choice was now giving up herself to another in a manner almost as scandalous as hers could be. But the glittering shoe of a great estate, and of fine things, which the deceived creature that was now my deceiver represented every hour to my imagination, hurried me away, and gave me no time to think of London, or of anything there, much less of the obligation I had to a person of infinitely more real merit than what was now before me. But the thing was done. I was now in the arms of my new spouse, who appeared still the same as before, great even to magnificence, and nothing less than £1,000 a year could support the ordinary equipage he appeared in. After we had been married about a month, he began to talk of my going to Westchester in order to embark for Ireland. However, he did not hurry me, for we stayed there near 3 weeks longer, and then he sent to Chester for a coach to meet us at the Black Rock, as they call it, over against Liverpool. Thither we went in a fine boat they call a pinnace, with 6 oars, his servants and horses and baggage going in the ferry-boat. He made his excuse to me that he had no acquaintance in Chester, but he would go before and get some handsome apartment for me at a private house. I asked him now how long we should stay at Chester. He said not at all, any longer than 1 night or 2, but he would immediately hire a coach to go to Holyhead. Then I told him he should by no means give himself the trouble to get private lodgings for 1 night or 2, for that Chester being a great place, I made no doubt but that there would be very good inns at accommodation enough. So we lodged at an inn in the West Street, not far from the cathedral. I forgot what sign it was at. Here my spouse, talking of my going to Ireland, asked me if I had no affairs to settle at London before we went off. I told him no, not of any great consequence, but what might be done as well by letter from Dublin. "Madam," says he, very respectfully, "I suppose the greatest part of your estate, which my sister tells me is most of it in money in the Bank of England, lies secure enough, but in case it required transferring, or any way altering its property, it might be necessary to go up to London and settle those things before we went over." I seemed to look strange at it, and told him I knew not what he meant, that I had no effects in the Bank of England that I knew of, and I hoped he could not say that I had ever told him I had. No, he said, I had not told him so, but his sister had said the greatest part of my estate lay there. "And I only mentioned it, me dear," said he, "that if there was any occasion to settle it, or order anything about it, we might not be obliged to the hazard and trouble of another voyage back again. For," he added, "that he did not care to venture me too much upon the sea." I was surprised at this talk, and began to consider very seriously what the meaning of it must be, and it presently occurred to me that my friend, who called him brother, had represented me in colours which were not my due, and I thought, since it was come to that pitch, that I would know the bottom of it before I went out of England, and before I should put myself into I knew not whose hands in a strange country. Upon this I called his sister into my chamber the next morning, and letting her know the discourse her brother and I had been upon the evening before, I conjured her to tell me what she had said to him, and upon what foot it was that she had made this marriage. She owned that she had told him that I was a great fortune, and said that she was told so at London. "Told so?" says I warmly. "Did I ever tell you so?" "No," she said. "It was true I did not tell her so, but I had said several times that what I had was in my own disposal." "I did so," returned I very quickly and hastily, "but I never told you I had anything called a fortune. No, not that I had £100, or the value of £100 in the world." "And how did it consist with my being a fortune," said I, "that I should come here into the north of England with you, only upon the account of living cheap. At these words, which I spoke warm and high, my husband, her brother, as she called him, came into the room, and I desired him to come and sit down, for I had something of moment to say before them both, which it was absolutely necessary he should hear. He looked a little disturbed at the assurance with which I seemed to speak it, and came and sat down by me, having first shut the door, upon which I began, for I was very much provoked, and turning myself to him, "I am afraid," says I, "my dear," for I spoke with kindness on his side, "that you have a very great abuse put upon you, and an injury done you never to be repaired in your marrying me, which, however, as I have had no hand in it, I desire I may be fairly acquitted of it, and that the blame may lie where it ought to lie, and nowhere else, for I wash my hands of every part of it." "What injury can be done me, my dear?" says he. "In marrying you, I hope it is to my honour and advantage every way." "I will soon explain it to you," says I, "and I fear you will have no reason to think yourself well used. But I will convince you, my dear," says I again, "that I have had no hand in it." And there I stopped a while. He looked now scared and wild, and began, I believe, to suspect what followed. However, looking towards me and saying only, "Go on," he sat silent, as if to hear what I had more to say. So I went on. "I asked you last night," said I, speaking to him, "if ever I made any boast to you of my estate, or ever told you I had any estate in the Bank of England, or anywhere else, and you owned I had not, as is most true, and I desire you will tell me here, before your sister, if ever I gave you any reason from me to think so, or that ever we had any discourse about it." And he owned again I had not, but said I had appeared always as a woman of fortune, and he depended on it that I was so, and hoped he was not deceived. "I am not inquiring yet whether you have been deceived or not," said I. "I fear you have, and I too. But I am clearing myself from the unjust charge of being concerned in deceiving you. I have been now asking your sister if ever I told her of any fortune or estate I had, or gave her any particulars of it, and she owns I never did." "And pray, madam," said I, turning myself to her, "be so just to me before your brother, to charge me, if you can, if ever I pretended to you that I had an estate. And why, if I had, should I come down into this country with you on purpose to spare that little I had, and live cheap?" She could not deny one word, but said she had been told in London that I had a very great fortune, and that it lay in the Bank of England. "And now, dear sir," said I, turning myself to my new spouse again, "be so just to me as to tell me who has abused both you and me so much as to make you believe I was a fortune, and prompt you to court me to this marriage." He could not speak a word, but pointed to her, and after some more pause, flew out in the most furious passion that ever I saw a man in my life, cursing her and calling her all the whores and hard names he could think of, and that she had ruined him, declaring that she had told him I had 15,000 pounds, and that she was to have 500 pounds of him for procuring this match for him. He then added, directing his speech to me, that she was none of his sister, but had been his whore for 2 years before, that she had had 100 pounds of him in part of this bargain, and that he was utterly undone if things were as I said, and in his ravings he swore he would let her heart's blood out immediately, which frightened her and me too. She cried, said she had been told so in the house where I lodged, but this aggravated him more than before, that she should put so far upon him, and run things such a length upon no other authority than a hearsay, and then, turning to me again, said very honestly, He was afraid we were both undone. For, to be plain, my dear, I have no estate, says he. What little I had, this devil has made me run out and waiting on you and putting me into this equipage. She took the opportunity of his being earnest in talking with me, and got out of the room, and I never saw her more. I was confounded now as much as he, and knew not what to say. I thought many ways that I had the worst of it. But his saying he was undone, and that he had no estate neither, put me into a mere distraction. Why, says I to him, this has been a hellish juggle, for we are married here upon the foot of a double fraud. You are undone by the disappointment, it seems, and if I had had a fortune, I had been cheated too, for you say you have nothing. You would indeed have been cheated, my dear, says he, but you would not have been undone, for 15,000 pounds would have maintained us both very handsomely in this country, and I assure you, added he, I had resolved to have dedicated every groat of it to you. I would not have wronged you of a shilling, and the rest I would have made up in my affection to you, and tenderness of you, as long as I lived. This was very honest indeed, and I really believe he spoke as he intended, and that he was a man that was as well qualified to make me happy, as to his temper and behaviour, as any man ever was. But his having no estate, and being run into debt on this ridiculous account in the country, made all the prospect dismal and dreadful, and I knew not what to say, or what to think of myself. I told him it was very unhappy that so much love, and so much good nature as I discovered in him, should be thus precipitated into misery, that I saw nothing before us but ruin, for as to me, it was my unhappiness that what little I had was not able to relieve us weak. And with that I pulled out a bank bill of 20 pounds and 11 guineas, which I told him I had saved out of my little income, and that by the account that creature had given me of the way of living in that country, I expected it would maintain me 3 or 4 years, that if it was taken from me, I was left destitute, and he knew what the condition of a woman amongst strangers must be, if she had no money in her pocket. However, I told him, if he would take it, there it was. He told me with a great concern, and I thought I saw tears stand in his eyes, that he would not touch it, that he abhorred the thoughts of stripping me and making me miserable, that, on the contrary, he had 50 guineas left, which was all he had in the world, and he pulled it out and threw it down on the table, bidding me take it, though he were to starve for want of it. I returned with the same concern for him, that I could not bear to hear him talk so, that, on the contrary, if he could propose any probable method of living, I would do anything that became me on my part, and that I would live as close and as narrow as he could desire. He begged of me to talk no more at that rate, for it would make him distracted. He said he was bred a gentleman, though he was reduced to a low fortune, and that there was but one way left which he could think of, and that would not do, unless I could answer him one question, which, however, he said he would not press me to. I told him I would answer it honestly, whether it would be to his satisfaction or not. That I could not tell. "Why then, my dear, tell me plainly," says he. "Will the little you have keep us together in any figure, or in any station or place, or will it not?" It was my happiness hitherto that I had not discovered myself or my circumstances at all. No, not so much as my name, and seeing there was nothing to be expected from him, however good-humoured and however honest he seemed to be, but to live on what I knew would soon be wasted, I resolved to conceal everything but the bank bill and the 11 guineas, which I had owned, and I would have been very glad to have lost that, and have been set down where he took me up. I had indeed another bank bill about me of 30 pounds, which was the whole of what I brought with me, as well to subsist on in the country as not knowing what might offer, because this creature, the go-between that had thus betrayed us both, had made me believe strange things of my marrying to my advantage in the country, and I was not willing to be without money, whatever might happen. This bill I concealed, and that made me the freer of the rest, in consideration of his circumstances, for I really pitied him heartily. But to return to his question, I told him I never willingly deceived him, and I never would. I was very sorry to tell him that the little I had would not subsist us, that it was not sufficient to subsist me alone in the south country, and that this was the reason that made me put myself into the hands of that woman who called him brother, she having assured me that I might board very handsomely at a town called Manchester, where I had not yet been, for about £6 a year, and my whole income not being about £15 a year. I thought I might live easy upon it, and wait for better things. He shook his head and remained silent, and a very melancholy evening we had. However, we supped together, and lay together that night, and when we had almost supped he looked a little better and more cheerful, and called for a bottle of wine. "Come, my dear," says he, "though the case is bad, it is to no purpose to be dejected. Come, be as easy as you can. I will endeavour to find out some way or other to live. If you can but subsist yourself, that is better than nothing. I must try the world again. A man ought to think like a man. To be discouraged is to yield to the misfortune." With this he filled a glass and drank to me, holding my hand and pressing it hard in his hand all the while the wine went down, and protesting afterwards his main concern was for me. It was really a true gallant spirit he was of, and it was the more grievous to me. 'Tis something of relief even to be undone by a man of honour, rather than by a scoundrel. But here the greatest disappointment was on his side, for he had really spent a great deal of money, deluded by this madam the procuress. And it was very remarkable on what poor terms he proceeded. First, the baseness of the creature herself is to be observed, who, for the getting £100 herself, could be content to let him spend 3 or 4 more, though perhaps it was all he had in the world, and more than all, when she had not the least ground, more than a little tea-table chat, to say that I had any estate, or was a fortune, or the like. It is true the design of deluding a woman of fortune, if I had been so, was base enough. The putting the face of great things upon poor circumstances was a fraud, and bad enough, but the case a little differed too, and that in his favour, for he was not a rake that made a trade to delude women, and, as some have done, get 6 or 7 fortunes after one another, and then rifle and run away from them. But he was really a gentleman, unfortunate and low, but had lived well, and though, if I had had a fortune, I should have been enraged at the slut for betraying me, yet really for the man, a fortune would not have been ill bestowed on him, for he was a lovely person indeed, of generous principles, good sense, and of abundance of good humour. We had a great deal of close conversation that night, for we neither of us slept much. He was as penitent for having put all those cheats upon me as if it had been felony, and that he was going to execution. He offered me again every shilling of the money he had about him, and said he would go into the army and seek the world for more. I asked him why he would be so unkind to carry me into Ireland, when I might suppose he could not have subsisted me there. He took me in his arms. "My dear," said he, "depend upon it, I never designed to go to Ireland at all, much less to have carried you thither, but came hither to be out of the observation of the people, who had heard what I pretended to, and withal, that nobody might ask me for the money before I was furnished to supply them." "But where, then," said I, "were we to have gone next?" "Why, my dear," said he, I'll confess the whole scheme to you as I had laid it. I purposed here to ask you something about your estate, as you see I did, and when you, as I expected you would, had entered into some account with me of the particulars, I would have made an excuse to you to have put off our voyage to Ireland for some time, and to have gone first towards London. Then, my dear, said he, I resolved to have confessed all the circumstances of my own affairs to you, and let you know I had indeed made use of these artifices to obtain your consent to marry me, but had now nothing to do but ask to your pardon, and to tell you how abundantly, as I have said above, I would endeavour to make you forget what was past, by the felicity of the days to come. Truly, said I to him, I find you would have soon conquered me, and it is my affliction now, that I am not in a condition to let you see how easily I should have been reconciled to you, and have passed by all the tricks you had put upon me, in recompense of so much good humour. But, my dear, said I, what can we do now? We are both undone, and what better are we for our being reconciled together, seeing we have nothing to live on? We proposed a great many things, but nothing could offer where there was nothing to begin with. He begged me at last to talk no more of it, for he said I would break his heart. So we talked of other things a little, till at last he took a husband's leave of me, and so we went to sleep. End of Section 12. Recorded by Nicole Doolin on the web at nicoledoolin.com.